WFSB Plus Original. This is the Capitol Rundown.
Welcome to the Capitol Rundown, where we bring you politics from both sides of the aisle that matter to you. We've got Democratic strategist Jimmy Tickey and former House Republican leader Themis Klarides. I'm Kara Sundlun. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Lots to talk about, right? We'll get right to it.
Always.
So right now we're talking about the SALT negotiations, which, if you don't know what that is, it's state and local taxes. And a big deal if you have a mortgage, which so many people do, because once upon a time we could deduct all of the interest on our mortgage, and now that's up to debate, I guess, how much. So we're talking about budget negotiations that are really going to affect people's politics, pocketbooks, and their politics. Themis, let's start with you. What's happening, and are we going to likely get these SALT deductions like we used to have?
Well, as we talked about last week, the budget session is done in Connecticut on the state level. So we're talking about the federal budget, so what's going on in Washington. And the House voted and passed by a small amount, but passed nonetheless a budget. And then it has to go upstairs to the Senate. And now the Senate is negotiating all of that. But downstairs in the House, there's an actual caucus called the SALT caucus. And as you mentioned before, it's state and local taxes. And it's the ability to deduct your property taxes mostly from your federal income tax.
Which we have a lot of that.
And it's most important in high property tax states like Connecticut, like New York, like New Jersey, like California. So the people in that SALT caucus it's a bipartisan caucus because there's Republicans and Democrats elected. And they feel very strongly about it because it used to be unlimited, as you said. But once President Trump became president the first time, he limited it to $10,000. That's the maximum. Because people who are very fiscally conservative believe that that's not a smart thing to do because it adds to the deficit. So $10,000 is not a lot, as we all know, because we pay property taxes here, and we pay a lot of them. And so the SALT caucus decided, listen, we're not going to settle for anything less than fill in the blank. And they negotiated. It was a very difficult negotiations. And they finally agreed to $40,000 if you make $100,000 or less. They wanted more than $40,000, but they settled on $40,000. And now the Senate Republicans are making a big stink about it in the Senate, saying, no, we'll just put $10,000 in just as a placeholder, and everybody's freaking out now. So it's going to be a big brawl because there will be people. Remember, it's close numbers, Republicans and Democrats. So it's not like a lot of people can go the wrong direction and have the bill passed. So it's a big, big topic of conversation now.
So, Jimmy, I would imagine with the Democratic caucus here, this is also bipartisan. We want those tax deductions. Right. I mean, you can easily, in a town like West Hartford, pay more than $20,000 a year in property tax.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This has a big impact on Connecticut and a lot of states that have dense populations and high property taxes, like we have in Connecticut and really throughout New England. And so our Connecticut members have always supported, raising that cap. As we've said, we never even had that cap until the 2017 Trump tax cuts in his first term that really only cut the taxes for multinational corporations. It was not good for regular everyday people, and that's when that $10,000 cap came into play. And so we really would like to see that be lifted so that people can, deduct their local property taxes at a much, much higher rate. So it did pass through the House of Representatives. It is now in with the Senate. The Senate does want to see some changes, but it would be good for Connecticut for that $10,000 to be lifted. Our Connecticut members of Congress are absolutely supportive of that, and we really need to see what's going to be happening between the Senate negotiations and the U.S. House negotiations. This is all a part of their budget process, and they need to get to a budget to fund the federal government by September. Their hope is to do it by July 4th. Not sure if that will happen over the next 2 weeks, but they do have until September to fund a federal budget.
Yeah. All right, so we also need to talk about the political violence that's been happening in Minnesota. I gotta hope that there's a bipartisan agreement that this is never okay. We've had 2 people who were attacked and killed. And so, Themis, I know you said in your experience when you were in office, you did get death threats, but this almost seems at a different level. What can be done?
I mean, most of us can tell you stories that most of us who've been in office. My parents got death threats on my behalf. I've gotten threats on social media, threats to the Capitol. It's terrible. And what happened in Minnesota is just heartbreaking. But then we saw what happened a few months ago in Washington in regards to the 2 Israeli embassy staffers who got killed. We saw what happened with President Trump when he was running, with Steve Scalise a few years ago, with Nancy Pelosi's husband. I mean, the list goes on and on. Governor Shapiro, Pennsylvania, arson in his house. I don't care what side you're on. This is just right and wrong. We can argue, we can yell, we can scream. That's what the process is about. But you do not hurt people. You don't damage property. You don't do any of that stuff. And I think, even in Connecticut, the speaker had mentioned he recommends taking the legislative plates off their car because legislators in Connecticut, senators and representatives have license plates that say the district that you're in. Recommending taking them off because you're less identifiable. I mean, I don't know if that's going to help or not help, but I think that if they're trying to identify you, they're going to find you. They're not going to find you by your license plate, but any little thing helps. And it's just horrifying that that's where we are in this country. And I don't care. Again, I don't care which party you are. It's not okay to hurt people. It's not okay to damage things. And you want to fight, just fight with your words.
Yeah, Jimmy, do you think that more needs to be done to keep people safe?
It's just terrible what happened in Minnesota, and as Themis said, we've been seeing really an increase. I mean, political violence has sadly always been there, but we're really seeing an increase of it in these last several years against our elected officials, and it takes a toll on the entire their staff, their family. I have not been in a statewide office like Themis, but sometimes there's threats against an office holder. I've worked for federal and state officials, and those sorts of threats rattle everyone, rattle their families, the whole office. Everyone then suddenly feels targeted. And so people are trying to do the best they can, whether you agree with them or not. And sometimes we can have major disagreements with what people are doing in terms of their policies, but it should never get to the level that there is violence, that there's physical violence. Vote at the ballot box, attend a protest. You can peacefully protest, you can peacefully find a purpose to make change. But this, what feels like an uptick in violence, should not happen. And leaders in parties and leaders in office should do nothing to fan the flames of others to go and to be violent. That's never, ever, ever the answer, and we can find other ways to make our points heard. And the license plates is an interesting idea. We need to be mindful. I mean, there's often been tips for elected officials to maybe not post something that you're at when you're at it, but to wait. So it's sad that we have to think about sorts of things to be really safe and secure, but in the times that we are in, there's been lots of efforts made at different headquarters of both parties to really secure those headquarters, maybe have cameras. It just feels like nothing is safe anymore, and we're seeing an uptick. So there's a lot of efforts being made at campaign headquarters to strengthen them for safety around people's social media and schedules, to really make sure that the people who are doing this work, and many times it's volunteer work, are safe, because they're just trying to do the best they can to represent a community or to represent a political party.
Right, bring up a good point. It's not just the elected officials, but all the staffers there.
Yeah, and and I think we obviously all agree on this, but inflaming the process doesn't make it any better, right? I saw a Democrat post, not from your office, but a Democrat post from a caucus in Connecticut, talking about, how all these things are terrible, we agree, but then kind of threw in the 250-year anniversary of the military as if somehow, the president did that, for his own well-being. That was planned during the Biden administration. I mean, those things don't get planned in 2 weeks.
Right. So let's talk about. You were talking about the just to bring it up to speed. It was a busy weekend with President Trump's military parade, but that's what it was being called. What you're saying, which is interesting to hear. I want to learn that it was planned earlier, and then of course there was the No Kings protest, which you were at. So this all the big military parade that some Democrats were very upset about. You're saying was actually planned during the Biden administration.
Right. That was being planned in the previous administration. Again, that's the military, right? That's not you and me. That's not Republican or Democrat. That's our military, who we all support. And those things take a long time, and 250 years is a long time. So that's not an overnight thing. Let's have a birthday party next week, right? I mean, that had been planned for a long time.
So there were also in protest a lot of No Kings, referencing that folks who do not want President Trump to act like a king, even joke about being a king, where there's been some stuff on social media. What happened at those protests, and did they change anything, or where do you think we are now?
The protests were wonderful. The one that I went to Manchester, which I think had about 1,000 people. The Hartford protest had its average between 8,000 and 10,000 people. You see these photos of people coming out over the weekend. We had over 30 protests around the state of Connecticut. I think it does a couple of things. For one, people that might be at home feeling like there's nothing to do, feeling there's no way to stop this, it gives them an opportunity to organize, to be with others, to be heard. And that sort of togetherness, I think now more than ever, is important and does make a difference for people. when they're feeling kind of alone and they're feeling like their federal government is not listening to them. But then also there are ways to have really a tangible difference coming out of a rally like that. You could run for office, you could volunteer to help campaigns. That is the kind of energy that we are seeing, that people want to engage. They very much disagree with this federal administration. They disagree with Donald Trump, who, wanted to celebrate his birthday in conjunction with this military parade. It's all a bit much. It's all a bit for show. And people do not like the way that he is acting as a king, as if he could run for a third term, as if he could be above the law, as if he could just do whatever he wants. You could disagree with the president, but there are checks and balances in our government, and there are checks and balances in what we expect for people in office. And so the rally simply said, we have no kings in this country. It was about being together, and it was about democracy. The power is with the people. It is not with an elected representative or an elected president.
Okay, so let's switch gears. There's a housing bill that we talked about on this program last week that really could affect a lot of folks because it deals with affordable housing and it deals with telling towns what they should and should not do. Themis, where are we at with this housing bill?
Well, we are still status quo. Session ended 2 weeks ago, actually today, and the governor has until next Wednesday to either sign it or veto the bill. Negotiations are still ongoing, our understanding daily, and that we should be able to have some information on that next week when we all gather.
Okay, so Jimmy, are you for this?
Well, the bill definitely has some good pieces in it, and I think many would agree with that. There has definitely been some misinformation and some disinformation about what's in the bill and what's not in the bill, and I think that's what the governor is trying to parse out and see here. What are the issues that he may have with it? He has said he was reviewing it, and he might want some things fixed. So it seems like what we could be dealing with is either he signs the bill and maybe asks legislative leaders to go back and fix some things from his point of view that should be shored up, or he has the opportunity and he has the ability to certainly veto the bill. I mean, this really was worked on very hard. It's a very large bill that does a lot for the unhoused, does a lot to think about ways that we can envision downtowns and envision old factory buildings and think about transit-oriented developments, adding more housing, more affordable housing, more mid-level housing. And it does give towns an aspirational idea as to where they could work towards to make sure that we're adding more housing in Connecticut. We need housing. There's not enough housing, and the housing we have is so very expensive. So by expanding the quantity and having more mid-level housing would certainly be good for people who are looking for housing, whether it's young people or older people looking for housing, whether they want to downsize or get their first apartment or first home. And so we're trying to work on the problem, and the governor is taking a look and seeing whether he vetoes this legislation, in which we'll need to start from scratch to address the housing problem in Connecticut, or does he sign it and then the legislature comes back into session. We expect they will come back into session anyway at some point this summer or fall to deal with some of the budgetary matters as well. So there would be another opportunity to make some fixes to the bill if he does decide to sign it.
Well, there's also a third option. I think that if he's either going to sign it and then ask for those changes, because let's just remember, this bill doesn't become law until October 1st. So it didn't become law the next day. So there is some time, although I always find that to be a risky way to do it. If he vetoes it, he wouldn't be vetoing it just to say, okay, I'm vetoing this and I'm not interested in this issue. He's very interested in the issue. He may not necessarily think it was written the right way. If he vetoes it, that would be with the understanding that we're going back to the drawing board immediately to rewrite it. Keep the things we like and we can agree on and change the things that we don't. So
the Republican issue that some people feel that there's too much government forcing all towns, to have a certain amount of affordable housing.
Right, too much state government, kind of taking local control away from your towns and cities, because that's part of the reason people move into a lot of our towns and cities, because we have so many different, and diverse places. We have rural towns and suburban towns and cities, and people make those decisions. And I do understand we have a housing issue. But saying, I know how many housing units you need in your town, and I know how many you need in your town, and that's what you're going to do. I don't necessarily think that's the most efficient way to do it. But there's other things in it, too. This bill was debated almost 12 hours. It doesn't allow a town to have minimum parking requirements for different residential structures. It tells you that it takes less effort now to move from a commercial property to a residential, because there could be environmental issues, all different things. So, there's a lot of detail in this bill, and I think there's good to it and then there's bad to it.
All right, so we will table that and see what happens, keep you informed. Finally, it's been making news every day about the ICE immigration raids, and we certainly are seeing them in Connecticut. We had the story of the young boy who was going to graduate high school in Meriden. They left his cap and gown out because he and his father went to a detention center. A lot of people protesting, saying this isn't legal. They can't just come in and rip people off the streets. Themis, can you give us your take, whether or not you agree with it? Is that legal? Can the federal government come into your town or city and do what it wants?
Well, they can come into your town and city, and if somebody is illegally here, they can remove them. I mean, that's the issue we're finding, right? But part of the issue is have some of these raids been so broad that they're taking people who are not illegally here? Do they know exactly who is and who is illegally here? I mean, we've seen lawsuits, right? We've seen all sorts of things going on. I mean, just last week, the president said that he wasn't going to go to hotels, restaurants, and farms, and because we heard people complain that they really need workers there, right? And then he changed that on Sunday. So, I mean, from my perspective, the federal government cannot tell towns and cities that they have to enforce federal law. For example, federal government can't come in and say, okay, Jimmy, mayor of Hartford, you have to enforce my federal law. I can't tell you your police in Hartford have to enforce our law. But if you then go and say, for example, hide somebody who you know is not legally here, and the ICE is coming in to take them, you could be arrested for obstruction of justice. So it's it's complicated. It's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution.
Okay, so the feds can't tell your local police, I need you to go help us do this.
Can't make the local police do it.
But they can come in and do things.
But if you obstruct justice, you can get arrested for obstruction of justice. So it's on the one hand, they can't compel you to do their laws, but you can't stop them from doing their laws.
Okay. Jimmy, what are you seeing and what's the status from the Democrats' perspective as we do see the raids happening here more in Connecticut now?
Right. You want to talk about deportations. Look no further than President Obama, who had more deportations in his term than any president in the modern era. I think it will be hard for President Trump to keep up with the deportations under President Obama. Now, we could debate whether that was right or wrong, but what President Obama did was they went after criminals and violent criminals, and they actually partnered with localities. So they worked with local police to identify criminals and then to deport them. And they did that at a pretty rapid pace. Whether people want to agree with that or not, that is the case. What we're seeing now is just haphazard. I mean, to deport or to round up a young person days before they were graduating high school in Meriden. Some guys that work at a car wash in Southington. Yesterday in Danbury, a mother with her kid's stuff still in the back seat and she was taken. It does not seem to be like so much else with the Trump administration. Very thoughtful, very planned out, well coordinated. It seems performative that they want to strike fear into communities that they could round up anybody at any time, but they don't seem to be going after criminals and violent criminals, which I think many would agree with. If we're going to have this sort of enforcement, let us begin with criminals. That is a conversation we can have, but it is cruel and it seems that it's inhumane, and it really does strike fear because you never really know where ICE might show up. And if someone has been in the community for many decades, pays taxes, has a family, kids go to schools, not a criminal, and then they are rounded up, it's wrong.
But, you talk about Obama because you can't talk about Biden, right? Because we know what happened, under Biden. The whole thing became a much worse problem than it was. For me, I have empathy and sympathy for people who are the examples that you gave. I do. But the reality is this is a law. If you're supposed to be here, then you're supposed to be here. If you're legally here, if you have a green card, if you have citizenship, then you can legally be here. Just because you're a nice guy or gal and you're illegally here doesn't mean we shouldn't say you have to go. I agree. The priority should be criminals and dangerous and people that are really posing danger to this country. But to say that he's not focusing on criminals, he's constantly focusing on criminals. He's constantly focusing on people that are like, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you're sick, you have disease, you killed somebody. So he's focusing on that. The question is always that none of us can answer. What's the data? Like, what's the the breakdown of how they're deciding to go into certain places? And unfortunately, we have laws and we have to follow those laws. So if you're not supposed to be here, you're not supposed to be here. We've talked about this before. It's 2025. Our path to citizenship needs to change. We have to make people be able to be here if they do the right things. That doesn't mean you just show up and you say, okay, you're a nice guy, you can stay. have jobs, pay taxes, that kind of thing. But in hindsight, just
there isn't
because
a very clear path.
you're
So people
nice
are
enough,
spending much.
you're a nice guy, we shouldn't make you leave. That's not how the law works.
Yeah, the idea that maybe structurally, rather than having to have people hide or hire expensive immigration attorneys that may or may not work out, changing the path so that the good, hardworking people might be able to stay and pay and learn English or whatever we need them to do, and the other ones not be rounded up in a scary way.
And keep in mind, because we have to say this in this conversation, we had a piece of legislation that really begun to do that, because really we do need action on this, and that actually happened under the former president, under President Biden, and that was led by our own senator in Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who really worked on a bipartisan immigration bill. But it died because at that point, candidate for president Donald Trump called the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and said, I don't want this to pass, because he'd rather run on the problem rather than have some sort of a solution before the election. So we do need federal action. We need legislation to address immigration reform. We do. And hopefully we can get to that at some point in the future. I don't know if it will happen under President Trump's term. It seems to be more about rounding people up and being more top-heavy with his administration. But legislatively, that is a place where we should go, and might even be bipartisan, to have some kind of a pathway and some contours around what we can do with our immigration system.
Any plans to just sit around a table and create a pathway, Themis?
Well, I mean, listen, unfortunately, under Republican and Democrat presidents, for many years, this hasn't gotten done.
Right.
It hasn't gotten done. I mean, that's equal opportunity blame there. That there's been Republican presidents and Democrat presidents for decades now that have not gotten this done. And I would hope that they would want to sit there, that they wouldn't base this on their, political advantage to do it or not do it. But we keep seeing that. And when we keep seeing it with Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats as president, nothing changes. Yeah. Like, what's it going to take to change?
Mm-hmm. Well, there you have it. That's Capitol Rundown, with politics from both sides of the aisle on all the issues that are pressing right now. We are streaming live on WFSB Plus on Wednesdays, but you can go back and watch the other episodes both on WFSB Plus and on WFSB.com. Just click on local news and you'll find Capitol Rundown right there. Thanks, guys, to our insiders. We appreciate your wisdom as always. Have a great day, everyone.